The story begins with Harold, the main character, happily returning from the village, looking forward to seeing his newly built house. But when he arrived, he knelt down in despair when he saw his beloved house burned to the ground. That house was the only thing he cherished in this world. Now it was reduced to ashes. Harold begins to wonder if he has any reason to continue living. In that moment, everything became meaningless. He wondered what had happened and why. When he returned from a day of work, the house was on fire. It was clear he was not the one who started the fire. This makes Harold suspect there is an arsonist in town who has chosen to burn down his house. If the arsonist had to burn something, Harold wished they had chosen a different place. As he walked out of the ruins of his house, he heard a man talking about a magical sword. That person said that the sword was found in a treasure room deep in the middle levels of the maze. Harold knew the labyrinth was a place where one could make a lot of money, just by exploring and hunting monsters. However, this news did not excite him. He understood that he did not have special skills to complete such dungeons. Harold is just a normal, unremarkable 25-year-old man, and maybe that's why he always worked so hard. Sooner or later, Harold would find himself completely empty-handed, because if he had a lot of money, he wouldn't feel so desperate when his house was destroyed like that. Thinking about his financial situation, he decided to go to the bank to check how much money he had left in savings. A few minutes later, at the bank in town, the staff informed him that he only had 150,000 rubles left, equivalent to a month's salary from his manual labor job. Even though he was poor, Harold was always a hard worker. In addition to his main job, he also works part-time in his free time. He even spent many hours picking wild vegetables and herbs in the mountains to sell as spices. Harold once saved more than 20 million rubles, but most of that money was used to build the house that has now burned down. He told the bank staff to withdraw all the remaining money. Since there wasn't much left, he thought he would spend it all. The first thing on Harold's mind was to buy an expensive meal, but then he thought he might try his luck at gambling. He stood in front of a building with a sign advertising a slave auction. Harold had heard people mention the slave trade, but this was not a common occurrence. As he was about to pass the building, a merchant stopped and asked if he wanted to participate in the auction. Harold replied that he was too poor to buy a slave. He knew slaves usually cost at least 2 million rubles, and he certainly didn't look rich, so he wondered why the merchant was talking to him. Harold replied that he was too poor to buy a slave. He knew slaves usually cost at least 2 million rubles, and he certainly didn't look rich, so he wondered why the merchant was talking to him. However, the merchant said Harold could come in and watch the auction if he wanted. A moment later, Harold entered the auction hall and was surprised by the number of people in attendance. He found a seat, and luckily, it was the only one available. Harold understood that the merchant had wanted him to enter so that the crowd would feel more excited when they saw the hall full of people. Soon, the merchant appeared on stage, announcing that he represented a group collecting slaves from all over. He promised to have a slave to suit the preferences of each distinguished guest present. The auction officially begins. Each slave is introduced. The person who raises their hand and places the highest bid will become the buyer. The auction begins with a beauty from the forest, an elf. As soon as she was introduced, all the auctioneers went crazy. Elves rarely appeared in the city, and now an elf was being sold as a slave. As soon as she was introduced, all the auctioneers went crazy. Elves rarely appeared in the city, and now an elf was being sold as a slave. The merchant offered a starting price of 20 million rubles. Harold was stunned to see people racing to bid with amounts he could never have dreamed of. In the end, the auction ended with the elf being sold to an ugly man in armor for 633 million rubles. Harold was stunned to see the amount of money people were willing to spend just to buy a slave. He realized that, no matter how beautiful or rare the elf, the auctioneers lived in a completely different world of wealth. The auction continued, and after hearing the huge amounts of money, Harold began to feel dizzy. Then, the merchant announced the last slave of the night, a dark elf. The crowd's reaction made it clear that no one wanted to participate in buying her. Buying a dark elf could mean bringing disaster into your life. The crowd's reaction made it clear that no one wanted to participate in buying her. Buying a dark elf could mean bringing disaster into your life. This belief is deeply ingrained in fairy tales and lessons for children. In fact, there is a famous story about a dark elf who brought trouble and bad luck to naughty children. Dark elves are rarer than normal elves. So Harold thinks most people here don't understand what they're really like. There were rumors about a family that made a deal with a dark elf. Then the family went bankrupt and were eventually killed in despair. There were rumors about a family that made a deal with a dark elf. Then the family went bankrupt and were eventually killed in despair. The merchant also said that she was still a virgin, and the highest bidder would have the privilege of being her first. In this country, elves are considered corrupt and cruel, but in other places, dark elves are known as virgins who bring good luck. Harold understood why they kept her for the final act. They thought everyone would go crazy for her, but because she came from another continent, they misjudged the deep discrimination against dark elves in the northeastern regions. Seeing that this was almost a losing bid for the dark elf, the merchant decided to start the bid at 150,000 rubles. Harold was surprised to find that he had not left the auction. Maybe it was due to the merchant's pride, but even at this starting price, no one stood up to bid. However, this amount was completely suitable for Harold, and after a few seconds of thinking, he raised his hand, signaling that he wanted to buy the black elf for 150,000 rubes. The other bidders were shocked to see someone daring to buy a black elf, rumored to bring bad luck. Actually, Harold had no intention of spending money, but the price matched the amount of money he had. Actually, Harold had no intention of spending money, but the price matched the amount of money he had. After Harold set the price, no one wanted to continue competing, so the black elf was sold to him at that price. After the auction ended, the merchant told Harold that he had made a great deal. On the western continent, he sold black elves for up to 1.6 billion rubes. Harold was so surprised that he almost spit out all the drink in his mouth. He asked the merchant if he intended to cancel the transaction. The merchant replied that he would not do that. He explains that trust is paramount in business, and if people always suspected that he would walk away from deals, he wouldn't have survived this long. At this time, look how the transfer of slave ownership came. Harold was instructed to drop his blood on the girl's necklace and make her wear it. Harold looked confused, and the merchant explained that this was necessary so that the necklace would identify him as her owner. The collar is a subjugation collar, designed to shoot spikes if the wearer intends to kill the owner, whose blood has been absorbed. The merchant also emphasized that no one can remove this necklace except its owner. Without hesitation, Harold slowly placed the necklace around the girl's neck and informed her that as soon as he put it on, he would be her master. After completing the procedure, Harold realized he had never asked her name. The girl immediately introduced herself as Ati. After this introduction, the two looked at each other for a moment. Harold asked what was wrong. She immediately blushed and thanked him, saying that from what she had seen, her new master seemed to be a good person. Even though Harold lost everything when his house burned down, but now he has a beautiful black elf as his slave. A moment later, Harold and Adi are walking through the town square. Suddenly, Adi noticed an ordinary elf passing by and immediately felt uncomfortable. Harold noticed this and asked her what was wrong. She explains that black elves don't get along well with normal elves. Harold understood that this was not a personal issue, but due to her race. However, he started thinking about the next step. He thought about returning home, but then painfully remembered that he no longer had a home to return to. A while later, Harold explained to Ati that they could not go back to his house because it had burned down, and could not stay at the inn because he had spent all the money he had left to buy her. However, he reassured her not to worry, because he had a plan. There was a tent at the foot of the mountain that no one used. He thought it would be a good place for them to spend the night. Ati agreed. Harold looked at Ati's simple clothes and realized she didn't have much to wear. He thought he needed to buy her some new clothes, but because he was currently poor, he couldn't do that right away. However, he promised her that he would do something soon. Harold felt strange, because just a few hours ago, he felt hopeless and was ready to give up after losing his house, but now he was starting to stand up again. After that, he told Ati if she needed anything to tell him. Ati replied that she would probably need weapons and armor. Hearing that, Harold was surprised and asked why she needed those things. Ati, noticing that Harold is short of money, suggests that they could enter a maze together. She said that even if they didn't go too deep, they could still make some money. Ati had experience with previous mazes, but she needed some time to get used to the new maze. However, that doesn't mean they won't make any profit. While listening, Harold remembered the slave trader's words about Ati having considerable knowledge of magic and having explored several labyrinths. Ati continued, pointing out that black elves were not popular in this city, so she thought it would be difficult to find a normal job. To demonstrate his strength, Ati threw a stone into the sky with great force. At first, Harold didn't understand what she was doing, but a few seconds later, a bird fell to the ground and died. Ati blushed a little, saying that she only had time to kill one bird. If she had a bow and arrow or a gun, she could shoot down 3 at a time. Harold began to think about Ati's magical knowledge, in addition to her fighting skills. This made him realize they could actually make a steady living exploring labyrinths. Not long after, Harold suggested they start preparing as soon as possible. But he also reminds Ati that no matter how confident she is, mazes are still very dangerous places. He said if she felt unsure, she could come back at any time because their safety was most important. Ati replied that she would definitely be careful and that she did not want to die. She added that she would do everything she could to protect Harold, with a bright smile on her face. This made Harold blush, realizing this was the first time he had seen her smile. Just then, he remembered what she said about protecting him, and secretly hoped that didn't mean he would have to enter the labyrinth with her. A few hours later, they arrived at the tent that Harold had mentioned before. Even though it was an unused tent, Ati was surprised to see that it was very well kept. Harold explained to Adi that he used to stop here for repairs, and it was convenient every time he gathered weeds and herbs. Ada immediately offered to take care of dinner, and after she finished, Harold found her exhausted and curled up in bed like a child. Harold approached, but she immediately felt his presence and woke up. He reassured her that there was no need to worry, and that she could sleep peacefully because he wouldn't do anything strange while she slept.
A few minutes later, Harold noticed that Ati was asleep again, but he wondered if she was just pretending to be asleep because she was afraid he would attack her because she was a slave.
Harold thought she might have been aware of what might happen, but that didn't make the situation any less unpleasant. A moment later, the rumbling sound of footsteps woke Adi from his sleep. Harold walked outside and saw an army of Imperial Knights marching past. He was confused as to why they were going east. Harold didn't really understand the political situation on the continent, but that scene made him wonder if a major conflict was approaching. Soon after, Ati admitted she felt a bit worried about the situation. Harold suggested they leave and move to another continent. She worriedly asked him where he would get the money for the trip, because Harold was currently extremely poor. Harold confidently replied that he would make enough money. He asked Ati if she had any specific location in mind, and she replied that she wanted to go to the southwest corner of the southern continent. Harold immediately agreed that would be their next destination. He asked Ati if she had any specific location in mind, and she replied that she wanted to go to the southwest corner of the southern continent. Harold immediately agreed that would be their next destination. Ati wondered why Harold didn't ask her why she wanted to go there, and he replied that now that she said that, he was also curious. In a moment of desperation, Harold had just lost his job and needed money to survive, so he decided to enter the maze. He had to ask his old boss to take him back and hope he wouldn't be scolded. When he arrived at the store, one look was enough for Harold to realize that his boss was definitely angry, but on the contrary, the boss was happy to see him back. He said that after Harold was absent for a while, he became curious and visited his home. When he arrived, he found that Harold's house had burned down, and even thought that he might have died in the fire. In short, the boss was just relieved that Harold was still alive. Harold sat down and explained his current situation. After a short conversation, the boss understood that Harold needed some money to prepare for the trip to the maze. However, the boss still wondered why Harold wanted to go to the southern continent. Harold didn't want to share details, just saying he needed to get there urgently. The boss understood and told Harold to wait a moment. He went to get something. A few minutes later, the boss returned with an envelope full of money and explained that he intended to give the money to Harold when he was more stable. He said there is an old saying that a teacher often gives a student a gift as a gesture of goodwill, but Harold reminded him that he had never received goodwill from his boss. Even though Harold was right, the boss still said that he had saved this money for him, and since Harold was about to leave, he thought this was the right time to give it away. He also admitted that Harold had worked hard for the past 15 years, and even though the money wasn't much, he told Harold to think of it as a retirement. Hearing that, Harold was extremely grateful and thanked his boss for everything he had done for him over the years. A few hours later, Harold returned to the abandoned house from his hunting trip, where he was warmly welcomed by Ati with a feast like a king. Harold thanked Ati for the meal, and then announced that he had earned some money, so it was decided that the two of them would go into town to shop for equipment. He gave her a wide-brimmed white hat, intending for her to hide her long ears that many people often distinguish. Harold noticed Ati was quiet after receiving the gift, so he asked her if she wanted a different hat. Ati affirmed that she was very satisfied with this hat. The next day, they went to a weapons store, where Harold asked Ati which weapon she felt most comfortable using. She replied that it was a difficult choice because each type of weapon had its own advantages and disadvantages. After a moment of careful thought, She decided to choose a sniper gun. The seller announced that the gun cost 50,000 rubes. Hearing the price, Harold asked her if she wanted him to buy her a more expensive gun, but she replied that this one was perfect for her. However, Adi went on to say that she really liked the single-shot rifle. If one could possess a special bow like the famous magic bow, its power would far exceed that of a normal gun. However, the Magic Palace cost about 6.8 million rubes, and she knew Harold could not afford such a large sum. The advantage of the gun is that, although it's not expensive, it still has quite good power and penetration ability. However, guns needed bullets, so they had to be careful not to waste any bullets. The disadvantages of the gun are that it is loud and difficult to aim compared to a bow, but it can be equipped with accessories to reduce the noise. Aiming is also not a big problem for Adi. At this point, Harold noticed that Ati was talking more than usual. She was clearly passionate about both bows and guns. When talking about the things she loves, she becomes very animated. A while later, Harold said he would buy her the gun and a silencer, much to her satisfaction. After completing his shopping, Adi was ready for the battle in the maze. And as her teacher, Harold realized that he also needed some equipment for himself. However, Harold replied that he was fine with the basics and thought it best to equip the experienced person first. He said he would buy equipment when he had enough money, and Ati understood. Harold thought for a moment, realizing that his equipment was terrible. Just a glance at his short spear was enough to see that it was poorly made. Earn money in the maze. Harold quickly explained the history of the labyrinth. It was mainly created to manage the increase in the monster population, which had to do with peace in the area. It allows many types of people to participate in exploration, and this is the main reason hunters are allowed to get monster materials from it. The goal is to prevent the maze from being occupied by monsters. After hearing this information, Harold understood more about the maze and wished his father had told him more about it as a child. But all his father said was that Harold had no talent, making him think he had no hope for labyrinths or harbored anything related to fighting. Apparently, Harold's father, who passed away, was a professional maze hunter. Harold knew that his father was highly respected in the industry and possessed many valuable skills. However, one day, 15 years ago, his father entered the maze and never returned. Not returning makes Harold believe his father is dead. His father's goal was to find the final location of the maze, deep in the lowest levels. This was not a wise decision, as he went in with only a spear which was ineffective in the narrow space. Harold lost his mother at a young age due to illness, and after his father disappeared, he became an orphan and had to fend for himself. This experience makes Harold cautious. He warns Ati that no matter how confident she is in her abilities, the maze is extremely dangerous. He reminded her that if she encountered any life-threatening situation, she should retreat immediately. The next day, Harold and Ati arrived at the labyrinth and saw many adventurers gathered. As they approached the entrance, an armored man stopped them. Based on his outfit, Harold could easily guess that he was a labyrinth guardian. After a while, Harold asked the guard if there was any entrance fee. The guard replied that there was no cost to enter the labyrinth, but at the same time he also mentioned a problem that he was warning adventurers about. Harold and Adi looked at each other confused, so the guard explained. There have been reports of a few monsters from the deeper levels appearing in the upper levels. Although the knights formed a search party, they found no results, and because no one had seen the monster for a long time, the search party was cancelled. At the end of the explanation, the guard warned that monsters might still be lurking in the maze, so he advised them to be extremely careful. Harold then asked Ati what he thought about the situation. She replied that it was not impossible for monsters to appear from the lower floors, but there were also many false reports, so it was difficult to be sure. However, because it is possible, Ati thinks they should be careful and stay alert. As they went deeper into the maze, they met another group of explorers. The group's leader took one look at Harold and commented that entering the labyrinth with such poor equipment was truly suicide. He even laughed at Harold's old spear. The group leader mockingly asked Harold if he was a fan of Edwin Smith, a legendary maze conqueror. As soon as Harold heard that name, he immediately recognized it as his father's name. However, Harold never thought of his father as a labyrinth conqueror or a legendary hero. Meanwhile, the group leader noticed Ati and commented that she was very beautiful, adding that she also had a nice figure. He moved forward to touch her, but Harold immediately reacted, asking him to step back and pointing the spear at his neck. Still maintaining a strong fighting stance, Harold declared that the man was not allowed to look at or touch his woman anymore, otherwise it would be the end for him. After this confrontation, the other adventurers were amazed at Harold's strength and agility, especially since they had thought him weak and small. However, Harold felt strange that they were so surprised, because they should have realized his abilities sooner. In the tense atmosphere, the leader, sweat pouring down, asked Harold to relax, insisting that he was just joking. At the same time, Harold turned to look at Ahti and noticed that she had a strange look on her face. He hoped she wasn't angry with him. Not long after, Harold put down his spear and said that he had no time to worry about low-class people like them, then suggested that they continue on their way. As Harold walked away, the adventurers were still shocked by his lightning-fast attack. They had looked at Harold as a rookie, but from the way he acted, they all understood that it would be a mistake to tease him if they didn't want to get into trouble. Minutes later, Harold and Erdi reached the maze, where they observed the glowing walls and floors, known as maze lights. At that moment, with a red face, Ahti thanked Harold for standing up to protect her from the cowardly adventurers. She whispered that she was surprised when Harold called her his woman, adding that she had always longed to be with him. Harold couldn't hear her clearly because she was whispering, but he only replied that he was glad she felt that way. While they remained standing on the edge of the cave, Ahti knelt down on one knee and fired a shot from the sniper rifle, aiming deep into the darkness of the cave. Ahti didn't expect to hit the target, but surprisingly, she defeated a lizard monster cleanly. Harold was amazed because he couldn't even see anything in the dark. Ahti then said that it was just a small monster, explaining that from birth she had excellent eyes and ears. Hearing this, Harold realized that he always thought Ati had talent, but her skills and abilities far exceeded his expectations. Harold then asked Ati if they could go deeper into the maze, and she replied that she had only ever explored the middle levels, but could not go deeper alone. Harold immediately understood that this meant she had had comrades in the past, and Ati confirmed it. She went on to explain that while on the Western continent, she's been a member of an all-female Labyrintha adventuring party for some time. But before she could continue, Harold noticed her hesitation, so he comforted her that if she didn't want to share, she didn't have to. Ahti replied that Harold was very kind, but she thought this was a good opportunity to talk about her past. She began to summarize what had happened. It seemed that the leader of her group had fallen in love with a man and had spent a large portion of the group's profits on him. One day, Ahti was drugged, and when she woke up, she discovered she had been sold to a slave trader. Ahti isn't entirely sure, but she guessed that her leader had sold her, for a virgin dark elf was a rare and valuable commodity. After hearing this story, Harold felt sorry for Ati and said that her leader was bad for doing so. However, Ahti looks at the positive side of the situation. She believed that if her leader hadn't loved that man and sold her, she would not have become Harold's slave. She even said that if she were sold to a cruel master, she would deeply resent her leader. Harold, although he didn't think he had done anything particularly good as master, was surprised to hear her say that. However, from Ati's words, Harold silently promised himself that he would try his best to become a good master to her. At the same time, he realized he understood her feelings better. Meanwhile, Ahti is lost in thought, realizing that he has truly fallen in love with Harold. At this moment, she may be willing to do anything for him, just like her leader once did for someone else. A moment later, Ahti continued to use his sniper rifle to take down more cave rats, while Harold took care of skinning them. After several repetitions of this, Harold suggested they return home. On the way back, they saw a giant door ahead, and they both thought there might be treasure behind. Harold, out of curiosity, suggested they stop to check what was behind the door. Before entering, Ati used magic to summon a few butterflies. Harold was surprised to see her do so, and then noticed some butterflies stopping in random positions, confusing him. Ati explains that these are magical butterflies she created, and they are attracted to places where malice can be felt, which is why some stop at specific spots. Those areas have traps. Ati also added that she has many other spells, but none of them can be used directly in combat. At that moment, one of her butterflies landed right in front of them, indicating that there were still a few traps ahead. But the good news was that there might still be treasure. Ati explains to Harold that no one has dared to enter this area, but since there are many adventurers on the upper floors, it is possible that this is a new treasure that has appeared. Harold didn't understand very well about the so-called newly appearing treasure, so Ati further explained that, according to rumors, the labyrinth has a will of its own, After the treasure is taken, the maze will partially collapse after a number of days. And over time, it will move the treasure to a new location while resetting the trap. Hearing and understanding this, Harold added that there are also rumors that labyrinths create monsters. A few minutes later, they reached a room where a beautiful knife lay in the middle. However, Adi's danger-sensing butterflies stopped on the knife, so she assumed it might be cursed, something rare in the upper levels of the maze. Harold, lacking knowledge about the maze, asked Ati what to do next. She replied that if the curse had only negative effects, they wouldn't be able to use the knife, and no one would buy it, even if they tried to sell it. However, they can try to determine the type of curse by using spells or special magical tools. Harold decided to leave the knife behind for now, and wait until he had the right tools to identify the curse. A few seconds later, Harold asked if those magic tools were expensive. Adi replied that they were indeed very expensive, the price of a house. Hearing that, Harold could hardly believe it, because his old house took 15 years of saving to build. Ati went on to say that if they could earn a steady income from the lower levels of the labyrinth, maybe they could save enough money to buy magic tools within a month, and if they were lucky, you can earn enough in one expedition. However, Harold comforts Aed that if they end up not being able to afford the magic tool, she doesn't need to worry about it anymore. He told her to relax and focus on making safe money, as their main goal was to finance the journey. Adi smiled and agreed with him. As they continued through the maze, they encountered a large crowd and decided to see what was going on. The crowd confirmed that the rumors about him smugly boasting during labyrinth explorations were true. Right now, he was bragging about the elf slave he had just purchased. Harold felt uncomfortable seeing her being treated so poorly. He wondered why the elf didn't do anything to protest. Adi explains that the slave collar will prevent the elf from harming his master. This man considered the slave elf a great achievement because she was beautiful, knew how to use magic, was not only useful in the maze, but could also entertain him in the bedroom. Seeing Ati's expression, Harold knew she felt very sorry for the elf. He told Ati that if seeing it made her uncomfortable, she didn't have to look anymore. A moment later, Harold suggested they keep going. A few hours later, they left the crowd and continued their journey. They go to the Napole trading house, where Harold tells Adi that when he worked for his employer, Silversmith, he frequently traded with this company. It's famous for buying whatever materials people collect from the labyrinth. Once inside, Harold is greeted by a man named Tosu. Through the conversation, it can be seen that they are very familiar with each other. Harold then told Tosu that he wanted to sell some of the animal skins he collected from the maze. Tosu was surprised and commented that he did not expect Harold to give up his job as a jeweler to become a labyrinth explorer. Harold explains that he needs money to go to the southern continent. Realizing the urgency of Harold's situation, Tosu decided not to ask too many questions so as not to waste time. Tosu examined the pelts and said they were Mogranti pelts, each worth 15,000 rubes, for a total of 120,000 rubes. Harold was amazed at this amount of money, because his daily salary as a jeweler was only about 7,000 rubes, almost double his income from exploring the labyrinth. Harold realized he could save money faster than expected. Then he asked Tosu about the cost of traveling to the southern continent, and Tosu replied that it would cost about 3 million rubes for both of them to go through the western continent. And if they wanted to go straight to the southern continent, it would cost about 10 million rubes for both of them. The reason the direct route to the South Continent was expensive was because it passed through a remote area where monsters from the underwater labyrinth were active. However, going through the Western Continent was cheaper and safer. Harold, always prioritizing safety, decided they would take the route through the Western Continent. He also thought that if they could earn another 2 million rubes, they would have enough. With an initial estimate of around 5 million rubes, Harold had a clear idea of what needed to be done. They continued to hunt monsters in the maze, and a week later, when they returned to the trading store, they realized they had earned more than 170,000 rubes in just 1 week. After deducting living expenses, they were left with 120,000 rubes. Harold then said that he wanted to start hunting monsters in the intermediate levels soon, and Ati agreed. So he announced that tomorrow they would start exploring the intermediate floors. However, at that time, he had no idea of the challenges they were about to face. On the next day, they finally entered the intermediate floors, and Harold felt nervous about all the monsters he might encounter. At first, Ati led the way, but she suddenly stopped. causing Harold to ask what was going on. She replied that she did not like the atmosphere in the cave. Harold felt confused as to why she felt that way, and almost thought they might have gotten lost. Adi assured her that was not the case, but she sensed something big was approaching. At that moment, they heard a loud noise, and Atith immediately suggested that they run away and find shelter. A moment later, Harold stood stunned when he saw a giant monster appear from a narrow opening in the cave. At the same time, Ate was also scared, but tried to stay calm. Based on the monster's shape, Ade realized it was a dangerous earth dragon from the lower floors. Harold was surprised to hear that an earth dragon was present on the lower floors. Adi then apologizes to Harold and explains that she can't do anything to the monster with regular bullets, which indicates that its skin is extremely thick and difficult to break. Not wanting to risk their lives, Harold suggested they retreat and return home. But at that moment, they heard a cry for help. At the same time, the cry quickly approached them. A moment later, the owner of that panicked voice was the man they had met before, the one who had abused his elf slave. Not caring about that, he ran towards them, saying that a high-level monster had appeared and he needed help. When he approached Adi and Harold, he immediately knelt down and explained that he was part of a group of 4 people. When his comrades saw the dragon, they hid in a narrow crevice, but soon the monster found them. Now, the dragon is waiting out there, watching for his comrades to come out. After listening to the man's story, Harold suddenly remembered where he had met this person. Just a few seconds later, he suddenly realized that this was the person who threatened Ati. Harold thought it was too late to go back and call for help, and he wasn't sure if anyone could defeat such a powerful dragon. Considering the current situation, Harold realized that it was extremely unreasonable to fight the monster alone. But just as he was about to refuse the man's plea for help, the man began to cry, saying that some of his comrades had children, and if they died, the children's lives would be ruined. This reminds Harold of when his father entered the maze and never returned. Harold realized that if he refused to help, the children of this man's comrades would have to endure the same pain he had experienced. With his fists clenched and his eyes stern, he asked the man where his comrades were hiding. This question marked Harold's decision to help. A moment later, Adi asked about the current situation. Harold took a deep breath and explained that he had heard about children who were in danger of losing their parents, and he could not stand by and not do his best to help in such a situation. Adi suggested that Harold use her secret weapon, but before he could finish speaking, Harold transformed into a superhuman in an instant and rushed to save the adventurers. Ate felt worried and called his name to stop, but it was too late. Harold ran until he reached the collapsed wall where the dragon was waiting. He saw 4 adventurers hiding in a corner facing the monster, while the dragon just sat there, waiting for them to come out. Harold thought that if there was only one monster, defeating it wouldn't be difficult. He sensed the dragon's complacency and arrogance. Perhaps that was why it hadn't discovered him yet, so Harold believed he could win. He prepared to attack, tensing every muscle and nerve as he accumulated a huge amount of energy from another dimension. This overwhelming force tore apart every part of his flesh. He put all this power into the short spear and launched an attack at the monster. However, the power he used was not magic, but violent energy, something that should not exist in this world. And the price to pay when using such power is extremely expensive. Meanwhile, after Harold defeated the monster with his strange powers, he lay prone on the ground. A moment later, Adi rushed to his side. She immediately touched him to check his condition. Harold opened his eyes, not sure where he was, but replied that he was fine, just a little dizzy. However, he added that he thought there were no serious consequences from the battle. Ade was extremely worried about his health, especially when he saw him fall with blood on his face. She asks Harold to promise that he will be more careful next time in similar situations, and he agrees with a smile. Soon after, the adventurer group that Harold had saved came to thank him for risking his life to save them. They saw him as their savior, believed they would never see their children again, and were certain they would die. Harold felt their sincerity and humbly accepted their thanks. After defeating the monster, Harold intended to sell part of its body, but he knew dissecting the dragon would be difficult, especially since its skin was very hard. After Harold mentioned this, Ati commented that the earth dragon was an incredibly powerful monster, and that its skin was made from dragon metal. Even though disassembling the monster was difficult, she wondered how someone as small and seemingly weak as Harold could create a crack in the earth dragon's body. Harold explains to Adi that he used a special skill called Burning Piercing Spear, but every time he used it, he lost consciousness, so he couldn't rely on it too often. Adi remembered the horrifying moment when Harold fainted and begged him not to use that skill again. Harold promises her that he will try to avoid using it. Not long after, the adventure group that Harold had saved offered to help him bring back the monster's body. They felt they owed him, so this was the least they could do in return. Harold accepted with a smile. In his heart, he wondered how much a monster at this deep level was worth. A few hours later, Harold went to the exchange shop, where the receptionist informed him that the materials he brought back were worth 13 million rubes. When he heard that amount of money, Harold almost had a heart attack. Cold sweat broke out on his face. He realized why the maze attracted so many people. The receptionist then informed that since the amount exceeded 10 million rubes, he needed to fill in his bank information. As he did so, Harold thought about how long it had been since he last used that fighting skill, and the exhaustion it brought to his body. But in the end, the pain and fatigue were worth it. 2 days later, Harold was surprised to see that 13 million rubes had actually been transferred to his account. I still can't believe it. But soon, he realized that he and Ati now had enough money to go to the western mainland. After successfully withdrawing the money, he returned to the cabin, carrying a peach pie that Ati had been craving for. He told her that he bought it as a gift, because he asked her to stay home. Adi thanked Harold and immediately took a bite of the cake. She commented that the cake was delicious. Harold then announced that they had saved enough money and would leave for the port city the next day. The next day, they arrive at the edge of town, where they are introduced to the carriage that will take them to the port city. From there, they will board a train to the southern continent. When the two climbed into the carriage and began their journey, Harold, after everything he's been through from losing his home to a fire to defeating the Earth Dragon, admitted that he never thought he would find himself in such situations. He realized he was lost in thought and didn't want Ati to know he was worried, so he asked Ati if she had ever been to the western mainland. Ati replied that she didn't think it was a bad place. Although there are many different races, this often leads to conflict, but that diversity creates a special attraction. Harold then told her that he would need her help to guide him in the southern continent, as she was very familiar with the area. His words made Ati happy. She felt that Harold really needed her. At that moment, a beautiful girl with a sword and her grandfather, who was patiently waiting for a carriage, appeared. After a short time, they saw the Cat 1 carriage that would take them there, and it happened to be the same carriage that Harold and Adi boarded. Once inside, Harold was surprised to see two strangers. The girl's grandfather immediately asked Harold who he was, then began to closely observe his facial expressions and actions, suspecting that Harold might be the son of someone he once knew. At that moment, the girl slapped her grandfather, punishing him for being rude to a stranger they had never met. She introduced her grandfather as Varen Myers and herself as Cecil. Varen then mentioned his father's name, Gurgo, and as soon as Harold heard the name, he felt it was familiar, wondering where he had heard it. Before Varen could say more, Cecil asked him to keep quiet, then bowed his head and apologized to Harold for his grandfather's rude actions. Varen realized his actions had embarrassed Cecil, so he also apologized to Harold. Not long after, Varen mentioned that he and Cecil were on their way to the western continent, and Harold replied that he was going in that direction as well. They realized that they will be companions for a short time. The atmosphere becomes friendly. Both groups look forward to this time. A few hours later, they arrived at the port city, where both groups parted ways. As they parted ways, Cecil mentioned that she and her grandfather would be boarding a ship called the Ballastia, and if Harold and Adi hadn't chosen a ship yet, they could consider boarding the Ballastia together. They waved goodbye. Then Harold suggested that they find a good ship to take them to their destination, adding that it would be better to find a ship that wasn't too expensive. A few minutes later, they arrived at the dock, where a bald merchant with a pair of glasses greeted them. The merchant told Harold that there were many ships parked, so he had a good chance of finding the right one. Harold understood and asked the merchant about the Ballastia. The merchant replied that it was just an ordinary ship, nothing special. For Harold and Adi, the ticket price is 2.8 million rubes, including a small room and 2 meals. However, the merchant, seeing that Harold was the frugal type, said that they could pay 200,000 rubes each, but this would mean staying in a large common room with about a dozen other people and only getting 1 meal. However, the room will be very dirty, full of disease-carrying rats. Additionally, ships occasionally sink and have to be bailed out. The merchant also announced that the ships would not depart for a week, so Harold and Adi still had time to decide which ship to choose. As they traveled together, Harold reflected that a luxury ship could cost up to 10 million rubes, and he knew that if they chose a faster ship, they would probably be disappointed in the food and living conditions on board. Harold decided that they would take a few days to think it over, and it might be a good idea to find a place to rest and eat during this time. As they walked on the street, a stranger suddenly ran past them. Just a few seconds later, Harold realized his bag, containing all their money, about 10 million rubles, had been stolen. But immediately, a bullet hit the thief's leg, causing him to stagger and fall to the ground. Harold immediately grabbed the boy's neck and demanded the bag be returned. It was at that moment that Harold realized the bullet came from Adi's gun. Strangely enough, Ati said she only shot to scare the boy, not to harm him. However, the boy stole money from Harold, and even though he was young, he committed unforgivable actions. While Ati scolded the boy, Harold noticed a foul smell coming from him, along with his tattered clothes. This prompted Harold to ask the obvious question, did the boy need the money? However, Adi objects to giving the boy money after he just tried to steal from Harold. She continued to scold him. At that time, a woman called the boy's name, Matsudo, asking him what he was thinking when he did that. Turns out it was Matsudo's mother. She quickly apologized to Harold for her son's stupid actions, promising to scold him when he got home. However, Harold reassured him that he had gotten his money back, so there was no need to punish the boy. He even advised the mother to teach Matsudo how to live ethically, so that he wouldn't have to correct him later. Matsudo's mother sighed, saying that she always tried to teach him the right thing, but he never listened. Matsudo angrily told his mother not to bother, explaining that he stole to help his father pay off the family's debt. As soon as he finished speaking, the boy ran away like the wind, causing his mother to hastily chase after him. Once they were gone, Harold and Eti realized that Matsudo's mother must be very worried, especially having to deal with such a naughty child. However, stories like this happen everywhere, so neither Harold nor Eti were too surprised. Then, Harold decided they needed to find a comfortable place to rest. Finally, they arrived at an inn and asked about available rooms. The receptionist replied that there were no available rooms today. They left and tried many other inns, but none had any rooms available. After trying more than a dozen inns, they couldn't believe there were no rooms left. Almost losing hope, they decided to try another inn. This time, what surprised them was that there was an empty room, although it was only a small room with a double bed, just enough for 2 people. When they were led into the room, they were surprised because the room was so small. Unexpectedly, the receptionist lied when he said there was a double bed. Harold began to wonder whether he should sleep on the floor or in the bathroom. Then he said he wanted to take a bath. Eti was surprised because he didn't look dirty at all. In fact, he seemed cleaner than usual, but she thought he must have been sweating without realizing it. Suddenly, Ati announced that she also wanted to take a bath, because such a small room easily caused the odor to spread quickly, and she didn't want the room to be filled with the smell of fish oil. She rushed into the bathroom as soon as she finished speaking. After the 2 finished showering, Harold walked down the hallway and overheard the 2 men's conversation. One person said that he had been to the northeast continent and was about to reach a city called Tawakul. He was traveling with his son, and they planned to go to Tawakul in about 1 to 2 months. He recalled that it had been more than 10 years since he'd last went there, and the city was very beautiful. His son was delighted with the news and eagerly awaited the trip. However, the boy still felt a bit worried. He said that since leaving the ship, he had heard strange rumors about the empire being destabilized. And if war breaks out, there will likely be checkpoints along the way. As soon as Harold heard this, he remembered the checkpoints he had seen before. He also heard from others that they had encountered similar situations, meaning he was not the only one who found this strange. However, Harold was not too worried about the war because he planned to leave the continent soon. Once back in the room, Harold jumped into the really comfortable bed. After relaxing in the bath, he realized he was very tired from the long trip, and so he thought there was no reason to sleep on the ground. And sharing a bed with Atiya is not unreasonable because it is only for sleeping. When Atiya returned from the bathroom, she found Harold already lying in bed and thought he was asleep. She came closer and playfully whispered in his ear, asking if he was awake, but Harold suddenly sat up and grabbed Atiya's hand, surprising her. However, Ati seemed to like this roughness. Leaning against his chest, Harold was surprised that she did not protest. but quickly realized that as a slave, she might not be comfortable protesting, even if she wanted to. This made Harold wonder what she thought of him, but he decided he shouldn't know. Ati, still in that mood, told Harold that she always knew this day would come. She also confessed that she had never traveled with anyone, so she wanted this trip to be memorable for her. She was well aware of her status as a slave, but she was also a woman. If they were going to be intimate, it would be Atia's first time, and Harold would be her first. Just when the moment was at its most intimate, Harold suddenly spoke up, saying he just wanted to discuss the ship they were going on. Ati was surprised. His eyes widened in surprise. Harold went on to explain that they still had a week until departure, but if they waited too long, the tickets would run out. After thinking carefully, he decided that Balestia was the best choice. To Harold, it was a normal ship, and the ticket price fit his budget of 3 million rubles. Not too cheap, not too expensive, a reasonable choice. Although Ati didn't seem excited, she agreed with Harold's decision. A moment later, Harold announced that they would buy tickets for the trip tomorrow. During the discussion, Harold noticed that Ati seemed unhappy. He wondered if something was wrong. Before he could ask, he saw Atiya lying on the bed with an annoyed look on her face, so he lay next to her and pulled her into his arms. Harold thought it was his right, as the owner, to hug Ati tightly. And as he hugged her, Ati blushed deeply, thinking that if Harold was ready to do that, then he could complete what she had prepared. She had been waiting for this moment for a long time and felt severely disappointed when things did not go as she expected. The next morning, the two returned to the blindfolded merchant they had met the day before and announced that they had decided to board the Balestia. Upon hearing this, the merchant said the trip would cost 2.8 million rubles. After Harold paid, the merchant gave them train tickets and reminded them that the train would leave promptly at noon, 5 days from now. He also said they could go straight to their bedroom on the train, but they must remember not to miss the departure time because their tickets would not be refunded. Leaving the merchant's shop, they quickly reached the port. Standing before the Balestia, they were both stunned by the ship's magnificent and beautiful appearance. They approached the entrance, where an instructor asked them to check their tickets before allowing them to board the train. Harold handed over the tickets, and the tour guide commented that they had chosen a great room with great views and ample space. Boarding the train, Harold and Atiya immediately went to their rooms. When Harold opened the door, they were both surprised at how comfortable and cool the room was. Ati saw a window with a beautiful view, just as the tour guide had said. Their room is below sea level, which means they can easily observe the creatures swimming outside. Harold realized Atiya really liked that window, so he decided not to bother her. He walked alone around the ship, spear in hand. While walking, he happened to meet Cecil. Cecil is happy to see that Harold also chose this ship. Harold replied that he had not found a better ship in the first place. Noticing that Cecil was not with her grandfather, Harold asked about him. Cecil replied that he was resting. Suddenly, Cecil suggested that since they were on the train together, they should walk around the city together. Harold found that suggestion a bit strange, since being on the same ship had nothing to do with touring the city. But before he could think any further, Cecil grabbed his hand and pulled him away. They soon reached the city, watching as Cecil enjoyed a snack. She noticed Harold wasn't eating anything, so she offered to share the food, saying he could eat the rest. However, Harold politely refused. After a moment of silence, Cecil revealed that her grandfather liked Harold very much. Although Harold wasn't sure about it, he realized they talked a lot during the car ride. Cecil responds that her grandfather likes Harold, which is why he talks so much. Her grandfather is an easygoing person, but usually doesn't say much to people he doesn't like. The way he talked to Harold clearly showed that he did not hate him. Suddenly, Cecil attacked Harold, but Harold easily blocked the attack with the spear. Surprising Cecil, her eyes widened in surprise. She was surprised that Harold did not dodge, but instead counterattacked, which meant that he saw and reacted to her attack in time. With a smile on his face, Harold thought that Cecil's strike was reckless, but he also admitted that her strength was impressive. Harold immediately asked Cecil why she attacked him so suddenly. Cecil smiled and explained that because her grandfather had taken an interest in him, she felt the need to test his abilities. Hearing that, Harold could only wonder, I wonder what crazy things this girl will do for such a strange reason. Sensing Harold's surprise, Cecil quickly reassured him that she just wanted to test his abilities and had no bad intentions. She even promised not to do that again. Cecil then suggested they return to the ship. However, after what just happened, Harold doubted whether this was a good idea. He suggested they go their separate ways. Cecil smiled lightly and told Harold that there was no need to be so careful. At that moment, they heard the screams of a young boy as two ugly thugs tried to drag him away. Upon seeing this scene, Harold immediately thought of a kidnapping, but after a few seconds of a closer observation, he realized that the boy was the same child who had tried to steal his bag of money. Suddenly, Cecil rushed towards the boy, saying she couldn't ignore him and had to help. Harold was surprised to see Cecil act without hesitation, and soon after, he decided to run after her. Seeing Harold following, Cecil asked him if he was going to help her. Harold replied yes. Cecil commented that Harold's gentle face matched his kind nature, making her think that he was truly a good person. After running for a while, they reached the beach and saw the kidnappers getting on a boat with the boy. Harold rushed to shore to try to catch up, but unfortunately, he couldn't, and the kidnappers slowly drifted away. Without hesitation, Cecil jumped on a nearby boat and told Harold to join him. However, Harold hesitated, feeling uncertain because this was not their boat. Seeing his hesitation, Cecil assured him that she would return the boat once everything was over. She also added that if anything happens to the boat, such as damage, she will compensate the boat owner. After being reassured, Harold agreed to get on the boat to save the boy. They rowed continuously until they reached an island, which seemed to be the kidnappers' hideout. Judging by the number of boats there were clearly quite a few people. However, Cecil doesn't care and vows to make them regret it one way or another. But before she could rush into the fight, Harold stopped her, suggesting that they take a careful look around first. Cecil objected, saying that there was no need to be too cautious, since both were very strong, so there was no possibility of losing this battle. Hearing Cecil's words, Harold began to wonder where her confidence came from. At that moment, Harold turned around and saw a strange boat floating by, but in just a blink of an eye, it disappeared. Not wanting to believe that yet, Towen thought that he was crazy. He told himself that maybe they were just fishermen. Harold dispelled that thought. Not long after, he and Cecil began walking around the island. Very quickly, they realized all they need to do is find where the bad guys are hiding. The two hid in the bushes to avoid detection. Harold stood in an excellent hiding spot, but Cecil wandered off. Harold quickly pulled Cecil's collar and warned her not to act rashly. Otherwise, they wouldn't find anything. He pointed ahead, pointing out bruised grass and footprints and some dirt that hadn't yet dried. This shows that someone passed through here recently and not very long ago. They followed the footprints to a wooden door, perhaps where the kidnappers were hiding. Suddenly, a heavy rain began to fall. Feeling the raindrops, Cecil hurriedly ran towards the door, trying to get inside to avoid the rain. But right before she entered, Harold pulled her back by his cloak and told her not to act foolishly. He explained that it would not be wise to barge in like that, because the kidnappers would immediately know they were there if they entered through the main door. However, Cecil disagrees and suggests they can kill anyone who gets in their way. After a few minutes, they sneaked into the building through an open window. Harold then suggested they hide in wooden crates to think about the next step. Cecil, however, found such caution absurd and saw no reason to be so cautious. She believes it's better to just eliminate anyone who gets in her way. Her philosophy stems from the belief that no one here is stronger than them. Harold, on the other hand, felt that there was still a possibility of encountering someone stronger, so avoiding conflict was the best option. Their main goal is to save the boy, so they should only fight when absolutely necessary. Harold's wise advice finally convinced Cecil. She agreed to be more careful on this mission, and even commented that Harold sounded like her grandfather when he said that. Just then, Harold and Cecil noticed several people approaching. Both were silent, trying not to reveal themselves. They overheard their conversation about the boy's fate. It seems the boy tried to steal their goods, and now he has to pay the price for that action. One guy suggested giving the boy to the boss, and the rest agreed, knowing that the boss was very cruel to children. The whole group eagerly waited for the boy's cry when he was punished. From what Harold heard, it seemed like the boy tried to steal from them, but only half of the group ran away. At that moment, a kidnapper discovered a spear sticking out of a wooden crate. At first, he wondered whose spear belonged to whom. He thought about cleaning it up, but just as he was about to touch it, a friend stopped him, saying that it was unlucky to touch someone else's weapon without knowing the owner. The group agreed and decided to skip it. When the kidnappers left, Harold and Cecil immediately jumped out of the crate and began searching for the child. While exploring the building, they accidentally discovered a strange egg lying on a luxurious silk pillow. They stared at the egg for a while. Suddenly, the egg began to move. Finally, the egg broke, and a small snake crawled out of the shell and straight into Cecil's shirt. Immediately, Cecil began screaming and jumping in panic, making loud noises that unintentionally signaled their presence to the kidnappers. Realizing the situation was getting worse, Harold quickly covered Cecil's mouth and hid her in a nearby cabinet. When the kidnappers checked the room, they were surprised to find it empty, with no signs of anything missing or tampered with. However, they quickly noticed that the egg had hatched. This makes them wonder if the noise they heard earlier was from the creature in the egg. The kidnappers believed the sound came from something inside the egg, and began to wonder where it had gone. They were also worried because the egg was a precious item that their boss brought back from a special place. If they don't find the creature, they will be in big trouble. Meanwhile, Cecil was struggling as the little snake in her shirt kept wagging its tail. It curled around her body, causing her to make some unpleasant sounds. Realizing that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, Harold had no choice but to stick his hand into Cecil's shirt to try to catch the snake. Cecil struggled as Harold searched through her shirt, trying to grasp the snake. She let out a loud moan, and Harold replied that he had no other choice. After a while, the snake seemed bored and decided to move down. Seeing this, Harold bent down and tried to catch it again. In less than a minute, Harold grabbed the snake and pulled it out after a while of searching. After everything was over, Cecil thanked Harold for his help and apologized for causing trouble. Meanwhile, the kidnappers are still rushing to find the snake that has hatched from the egg. However, they found nothing. Finally, they decided to give up, thinking that the boss had probably forgotten about the snake and that they could find it after selling the remaining stock. As the kidnappers leave, Harold and Cecil emerge from the closet. While in there, the tight space forced Harold to hug Cecil tightly to fit. Even as he walked out, Harold continued to hold her close. Cecil asked how long Harold plans to hold her. He quickly apologized. Blushing, Cecil replied that there was no need to apologize because she wasn't really angry. Harold then focused on the snake, holding it in his hand. He remembered what the kidnappers had said about selling the snake if they found it. Harold then focused on the snake, holding it in his hand. He remembered what the kidnappers had said about selling the snake if they found it. The snake also looked back at him with a powerful look. Harold asked the snake if it could understand human language. To his surprise, the snake nodded vigorously, confirming that he understood. With that, Harold was sure he could understand them. He continued asking the snake if it wanted to go with them. Since the snake understood, Harold thought it would not cause trouble, and felt this was a good idea. Cecil agrees, although she admits she's still a little scared after the incident with the snake. Harold smiled and said that the situation with Cecil had made him more interested in the little snake. After that, they continued their mission. After a while of dodging the guards, they finally reached the top floor and saw a large door in front of them. This seems to be the only place they haven't checked. But just as they were about to enter, they heard strange sounds coming from a woman behind a large door. Harold heard faint screams and immediately guessed it was a kidnapped child, meaning their sneak rescue plan was no longer feasible. Realizing this, Cecil asked Harold what the new plan would be. He thought for a moment and then came up with an idea, although he hesitated because it made him feel uncomfortable. But then Harold realized they had no choice but to break down the door with force. He informed Cecil that they would split roles. She would be responsible for rushing in and taking the child out as soon as they broke into the room. Harold explains that breaking down the door will definitely attract attention, and the villain's henchmen will attack them immediately. If so, Harold wouldn't be able to focus on fighting the villain while the child was still in danger. So as soon as they burst in, Harold wanted Cecil to get the child out quickly. Cecil thought the plan absurd and protested that such caution was unnecessary. She believes that killing all the bad guys from the beginning would be a better option. She is confident in her strength and wonders why she has to run when she is stronger than Harold. To convince Cecil, Harold looked at her with seductive eyes, begging her to follow the plan. Captivated by his eyes, Cecil finally agreed. A moment later, they kicked the door open and were shocked to see a giant Spider-Woman sitting on top of the boy, who was nearly unconscious. Harold approached and realized that Spider-Woman was draining the boy's powers. He quickly realized that this was the leader that the henchmen and merchants had mentioned before. Harold was still stunned, because he did not expect the leader to be a monster. In his eyes, she is a combination of half human, half animal. At that moment, Spider-Woman noticed their presence, smiled, and asked who they were. Harold didn't introduce himself, but simply announced that he and Cecil would take the boy home. However, the spider leader replied that that was impossible because she was about to wrap the boy in a cocoon. She further explains that the boy tried to steal her precious item and now he must pay for causing her trouble. She said that the boy would become compensation. She revealed that the item the boy tried to steal was a precious medicine, a cure for all human diseases, worth no less than 50 million rubes. Spider-Woman admits she didn't get the medicine legally, but with her powers she should have no problem. Hearing this, Harold suddenly remembered the reason he shouted to his mother, promising to find a way to earn money to save his sick father. Harold also realizes that not only are he dealing with pirates, but the leader is also a half-human monster. This makes the situation worse than ever. Suddenly, the half-human monster leader screamed, power surging like a Super Saiyan, claiming that being interrupted while torturing the boy and being spoken to rudely had angered her. She declared there would be no tolerance. Immediately, Cecil rushed to attack with his katana. After fighting, she realized that the spider leader was extremely powerful. Harold followed up with a powerful stab from the spear, then commented that cutting into her body was like hitting metal. He decided to try again. This time, Harold's second attack was so powerful that it sent Spider-Woman flying into the wall. As she fell to the ground, she couldn't believe that someone as seemingly weak as Harold could exert such great strength. Even though he was smashed against the wall, Harold felt that his punch did not cause much damage. At this moment, Harold realized the boy had escaped the spider's grip. He signaled Cecil to continue with the plan and save the boy. Cecil immediately took action when he received the signal. However, Cecil not only saved the boy, but also took the 50 million ruble potion. When Spider-Woman realized this, she screamed in rage and vowed to kill both Harold and Cecil. When Spider-Woman realized this, she screamed in rage and vowed to kill both Harold and Cecil. The henchmen replied that they understood the order. Harold smiled slightly, knowing that no minion could stop Cecil. But suddenly, Spider-Woman stared at Harold and changed her mind, ordering her minions to attack him instead of chasing Cecil. As they rushed towards Harold, it was clear that their main target had shifted to him. Harold began fighting with enthusiasm, easily defeating the first minions that attacked him. Spider-Woman was disappointed that her minions were too weak when facing Harold. However, the number of henchmen seems to have no end, forcing Harold to fight non-stop. It felt like he had been fighting for over an hour, but in reality, only a few minutes had passed. At this point, Spider-Woman realized her minions were of no use and decided to act on her own. She opened her legs and released a stream of white liquid towards Harold. However, Harold dodged easily. She continued to reach out, trying to catch him. But Harold continued to dodge until he fell onto the roof. Seeing Harold slow down, Spider-Woman teased him, asking him where his initial enthusiasm lay. With a sly smile, Harold replied that by controlling the amount of energy he consumed, he could save mana. Harold knew his spear was powerful enough to destroy an entire nation. As long as he has the spear, he will be fine. But if he loses it, he will be in trouble. Suddenly, a man with a melting face appeared from the ground. Seeing him, Harold realized he had been hit by the Spider-Woman's white liquid, and he concluded that the liquid was actually acid. As soon as she realized this, Spider-Woman launched another wave of liquid towards Harold, but luckily he dodged it in time. At this point, Harold decided to end everything. He felt he had lasted long enough, and his energy was gradually running out. Harold turned around to run away, but as he ran, he tripped and fell, and his face hit the ground. Seeing this, Spider-Woman realized this was her chance to finish him off and rushed towards Harold. As he neared his destination, Harold thought this would definitely be his end. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. From afar, Ahti posed like a legendary sniper. Just a few seconds later, she fired a shot from her rifle, creating a flash of light as bright as thunder, hitting Spider-Woman directly, causing her to scream in pain. After being hit, Spider-Woman's body immediately began to disintegrate. Within seconds, she collapsed to the ground. The henchmen stood and watched, unable to believe their eyes, not understanding what had just happened. They could only guess that their leader had been struck by lightning. When the leader was defeated, the henchmen knew they could not fight Harold, so they decided to retreat. As they walked away, Harold stood up, surprised to see Ahti standing in the distance. As soon as Ahti saw Harold, she ran back and hugged him tightly. Ahti later said that she didn't think she would make it in time, so she had to use lightning in the bullet. and of course, she made sure the bullet didn't hit Harold. From Ati's words, Harold understood that the dazzling light he saw was created by her, and he was surprised by her strength. Putting that aside, Harold was impressed that she had found him. She blushed and explained that she had marked him, so she always knew where he was. Harold is surprised by this, and Ati explains that she did it with magic. Harold admitted he didn't know such magic existed, and admitted it was convenient, especially in situations like this. Ati says that this magic is useful this time, but not invincible. The effect only lasts a week, then must be reapplied, otherwise it will disappear. In the end, Ati just felt relieved that Harold was safe. Harold gently hugged her and apologized for worrying her so much. In response, Ati begged Harold to take her whenever there was a chance he was in danger, and Harold promised to do so. The two walked out of the cave and saw Cecil sitting on the rock, the boy still unconscious. As soon as Cecil saw Harold come out with a girl she didn't recognize, she immediately asked who the girl was and how she got here. Harold quickly told Cecil to be quiet and not ask too many questions, saying it wasn't the time to explain. After a few minutes, Cecil reminded them that time was running out and they needed to leave quickly because the rain was pouring heavily. Even if they have a boat, they are not sure they can move safely. Harold understood the danger, not wanting to risk the boat sinking in the middle of the ocean, but fortunately, soon after, the sky began to brighten again, creating an ideal opportunity for them to board the boat. As they rowed, Cecil suddenly announced that the boy's temperature had plummeted, even colder when she got him to safety. Upon closer inspection, she discovered small spots appearing all over the boy's body. As soon as Harold heard this, he immediately realized the boy had been poisoned by the Spider-Woman. Cecil kept shaking and waking the boy up, but to no avail. She realized she had no choice but to use the potion that the Spider-Woman said was worth 50 million rubles and could cure any disease. Harold knew medicine could cure disease, but he also believed it could fight toxins. He also thought that this medicine might be what Cecil needed, but giving it to the boy seemed more humane and reasonable since he needed it more. With tears in his eyes, Cecil placed the bottle of medicine on the boy's lips. After a few seconds, the boy just coughed, making Cecil shocked and unable to believe that such an expensive bottle of medicine was. At that moment, looking at the boy's body language, Cecil concluded that he could no longer be saved. When they returned from dropping off the ship, the first thing they did was give Matsudo a solemn burial. Harold knows who Matsudo's mother is. She loves her son deeply and will do everything she can to find him. More than anything, she wanted to hold her child one more time. That is the love of a mother like her. Therefore, Harold could not show Matsudo's body to her. He also didn't have the courage to tell her that her son was dead. So Harold comes up with a better solution. Simply tell her that Matsado is missing and no one knows where he is. Meanwhile, Cecil stood silently by the boy's grave, reminding herself that she had gone through so much with the sole purpose of saving him. However, she did not regret her decision, and did not think that if she tried harder, the results could change. Cecil asked for himself, wanting to save Matsudo in his own way. After this event, Harold and Ati gave Cecil space, as it seemed she had found clarity in her thoughts. Perhaps this is one of the natural gifts of those who have sworn to follow the path of Kendo. Weapons always have a close relationship with life. To use them responsibly, users must understand the fragile line between life and death. The same was true for Ati, who fought for his life in the maze. Before becoming a slave, Harold thought that Ati might feel the same way as Cecil. Apparently, Harold is the only one in the group who has lived a normal life and has never had a chance to get used to such painful events. Meanwhile, Ati realizes that no matter how much he blames himself, he cannot change the truth about Matsudo. But as long as Harold was alive, nothing was more important to her than that. A few hours later, while Ati and Harold were walking in the city, they unexpectedly met Matsudo's mother. She was crying and clutching Harold's shoulder. She explained that Matsudo was missing and that his father had also passed away. His last request before he died was to see his son again and pat his head, but because Matsudo was missing, that wish was never fulfilled. Seeing Matsudo's mother in tears, Harold recalls that Matsudo went looking for medicine to save his father. But in the journey to save his father, Matsudo lost his own life, and because he could not return in time, his father also passed away. Harold constantly wondered if there was something he could have done better to save Matsudo. He thought that if he had handled the situation better, perhaps Matsudo and his father would still be alive. But then Harold realized he shouldn't think like that. No matter how you think about it, the truth is that Matsuda was poisoned, and they made the right decision to give him the medicine. Even if there's a slight change, the result will probably be the same. At that moment, Harold didn't know what else to think. Matsuda's mother, feeling there was nothing left to say, apologized for disturbing them. She vows to keep searching for her son until she finds him, because he is the only thing left in the world that she loves. She quickly left to continue her search, and when she was out of sight, a feeling of guilt overwhelmed Harold and Atiet. A few hours later, they returned to the ship. The days passed. Nothing unusual happened. Finally, the night before they were about to leave town came. Over time, the events of Matsudo began to fade and become part of the past. Although it was a tragedy, Matsudo wasn't the only person who died that day. So Harold tried to convince himself that he shouldn't let it haunt him for too long. However, Harold cannot stop thinking about when his own fate will come. He remembered dangerous moments, like when his house caught fire, and wondered what it would have been like if he had been sleeping inside, or during the battle with Spider-Woman. He also wondered what would have happened if Ati had not intervened in time. A few minutes later, Adik walked into the room, wearing sexy pajamas. Harold glanced at her quickly and immediately felt worried. She realized something was wrong with him and asked him how he felt. Harold held his head and said it was nothing, but Adia clearly saw that he was uncomfortable, as if he was suffering from an internal pain. Before he could deny his condition, Atia suddenly grabbed his head and kissed him, giving him a bold and passionate kiss. Harold was shocked by Ati's actions, but before he could say anything, she explained that from what she heard, that when a man is in pain, making love to a woman without overthinking is the best therapy. At least that's what she'd been told. Harold couldn't take his eyes off Adi's seductive body as she slowly took off her clothes and told him to do as she wished. He took a deep breath and asked her if she was sure about this. After Adi agreed, Harold threw her on the bed and pinned her down, saying he wouldn't be able to stop even if she asked to stop midway. In the end, it was she who asked him to do what she wanted, so Harold was determined to follow through. They started with passionate kisses, followed by hugs, moans, and passionate movements. They ended the night satisfied, while every man on the train was jealous of Harold because he made a woman scream with pleasure. The next morning, while Ati was still sleeping, Harold had long since woken up. He sat there, contemplating, and couldn't believe what he had done to Ati last night. However, he could justify himself by saying that it was Ati who pushed him to act on his desires. But if we look at the actual events, he would have to use her own words as the shield. Otherwise, it might look like he took advantage of her. At the same time, Harold believed that Adi said those things because she cared about him. Maybe she didn't expect him to be so serious. However, Harold knew that Adi had no choice but to accept if he wanted her because of the slave bracelet she wore. If Adi does not comply and the bracelet perceives it as hostility, it could take her life. But Harold was certain that he didn't want Ati just for her body. As Harold's thoughts became deeper, his mind became so hazy that just being in the same room with Ade made him feel hot, as if he couldn't control himself. He decided to walk around the ship to clear his mind, but it didn't seem to have any effect. While Harold was lost in thought, Varen happened to pass by and sat down next to him. Harold wondered why Varen chose to sit next to him. Feeling Harold's discomfort, Varen told him not to act strange, saying he just wanted to chat a bit. Varen then thanks Harold for taking care of Cecil earlier. At first, Harold felt confused about what Varen was saying, but he immediately remembered the incident with Matsudo. Harold did not expect that Cecil would tell his grandfather about it. Humbly, Harold replied that he hadn't done much and didn't need to thank him. However, Varen insisted on expressing his gratitude. Harold added that Cecil was much stronger than him, so even without him, she would be fine. Varen replied that strength and victory or defeat are two completely different concepts. He knew that Cecil could be very impulsive, something Harold had also noticed. Varen warns Harold to be cautious of Cecil's impulsiveness, as it could one day cost him his life. Cecil told Varen that she was unhappy with the way Harold handled the last mission, which made Varen realize that it was Harold who restrained her. Varen expressed deep gratitude to Harold for that. Varen also said that when he called Harold over, just by looking at his face, he realized that Harold was facing something troublesome. Harold admitted it, saying he was just trying to relieve stress. Varen understood and said he had a way to help. A few minutes later, Harold wasn't sure what had happened, but he and Varen found themselves in the middle of a practice match. Harold holding a wooden spear, and Varen holding a wooden sword. Varen says that if Harold wants to clear his mind, This is the best way to do it. Since Varen is someone related to Cecil, Harold thought that his swordsmanship skills must be similar to Cecil's. Before the match started, Varen told Harold not to worry about him and to attack with all his might. However, Harold did not feel comfortable doing so, especially considering that Varen was an old man. At that moment, Varen skillfully wielded his sword, and Harold felt a terrifying aura radiating from him, one that only those of extremely high skill could create. Harold immediately wondered who this old man really was. Varen introduces himself as Varen Myers, the Holy Sword of Old. Harold is stunned to learn that Varen once held the title Sword Saint. Although Harold still had little experience in martial arts, he clearly understood the meaning of the title. Cecil's strength was clear proof of that, and he now realized that she had learned swordsmanship from her grandfather, a man who had once been a sword saint, although that title was now a thing of the past. Not wasting any time, Varen asked Harold if he was ready for the match. Sensing Harold's hesitation, Varen smiled and asked what was worrying him, reassuring him that he could rely on this moment as support. Despite hearing what Varen said, Harold admitted that he was afraid that if he attacked first, he would be counterattacked immediately. Varen stroked his chin and agreed that it was indeed a possibility, but also warned Harold that if he tried to run away, he would not let him escape. Harold gritted his teeth in frustration, realizing there was a distinct gap between their abilities. At that moment, all Harold wanted to do was put down the wooden spear and run away. But after a few seconds of hesitation, Varen lost his patience and decided to attack first. Varen disappeared from Harold's sight, and in just a blink of an eye, Harold received a strong blow from the wooden sword. However, Harold promptly blocked it with a spear. Varen praised Harold for his quick reflexes, but also pointed out that Harold's eyes could not keep up with his speed. Harold admitted that he didn't see Varen's attack. This made Varen think that Harold had blocked the attack purely by instinct. Meanwhile, Harold is confused by Varen's calm demeanor and wonders if his power is truly restrained. After facing a barrage of attacks from Varen, Harold wondered how much longer he could last. But as expected, he couldn't last long and eventually lost the match. After the match, Harold realized he could only endure a few minutes. Varen asked if the workout helped Harold relax. Still lying on the ground, Harold reached out as Varen helped him up. In the end, Varen was right. Harold felt lighter in his mind after the match. He thought it might be due to fatigue from being defeated. At that moment, Harold decided to apologize to Ati, because he thought that was the best way to handle the situation. Harold thanks Varen for helping him regain his sanity. Varen accepted his thanks and reminded Harold that he was human, and that it was normal to feel lost sometimes. Varen shares that even when he was the official Sword Saint, he also had to face his own worries and difficulties. He observes that there are people in the world who brag about cutting out all worries. But Varen believes that is a poor excuse for neglecting responsibilities. Harold was surprised to hear that someone as strong as Varen also had worries and doubts. Varen continued, saying that even now, he still had many concerns. He told of a time when he chose to run away. This confused Harold. Varen explains that at that time, war was about to break out in the Northeast continent. The Empire is preparing to start a war to unify the continent, and the war will happen soon. Therefore, Varen chose to leave the Empire to protect his precious niece, Cecil, from war. As a former sword saint, Varen still had access to important information, and after careful investigation, he discovered that the Empire was falling into chaos. They are building a powerful army for war, and are even experimenting with terrible dark magic. He also mentioned that the Empire is currently experimenting with human-demon monsters. Harold is stunned to hear about these hybrid creatures, and wonders if the Spider-Woman he met earlier was the result of those experiments. Varen reveals that Cecil told him about the humanoid monster that Harold fought, and he immediately guesses that it came from the Empire. After fleeing the Empire, it became a bandit. But it was also possible that the humanoid monsters from the labyrinth rebelled and escaped. Although very rare, Varen explains that many such monsters are inherently fierce and do not hide their strength. From Varen's perspective, if he and Cecil had to fight these monsters, he would consider them weak. Harold had a strong feeling that if he were Varen, he could easily cut Spider-Woman in half. Harold realized that the Northeast continent was more complicated than he thought, and perhaps leaving early wouldn't be a bad thing. Varen is trying to protect Cecil from a war with an uncertain outcome. To do that, he left behind friends and relatives in his hometown, It was a decision he had carefully considered. Still, that decision continued to haunt him, as if he was forced to do it, and sometimes he wondered if he had done the right thing. Harold found it strange that despite carrying such heavy burdens, Voren did not seem sad at all, perhaps because he accepted and faced his worries. Meanwhile, Harold is still struggling with his own problems, but maybe it's not so bad after all. When Harold returned to his room on the ship, he accidentally found a ring and then went down to the ship's store. There he saw Algat. He saw a sample of silver clay in a jar. The shop owner said although the clay is not very pure, it comes from the labyrinth and costs around 100,000 to 200,000 rubes. Harold came with the intention of buying a gift to apologize to Ahti, and he thought that a handmade gift would show more sincerity, so he decided to do so. He asked the shop owner if they had silver carving tools. The store owner said he had some tools in the back, and if Harold bought silver clay, he could use them. The store owner thought for a moment about Harold's request to borrow tools, and asked if he knew how to work with silver. Calmly, Harold replied that he had been a silversmith for about 15 years. Before entering the room, Harold stopped in front of the door, thinking about what he should say to Ahti first. After a few seconds of hesitation, he finally decided to enter. When he entered the room, he saw Ahti feeding the snake they had caught in the previous mission. As expected, Ahti was happy to see Harold back. Harold asked what she had been doing while he was away, and Ahti replied that she had been busy taking care of Echidna, the name they gave the snake. Sensing something was wrong with Harold, Ahti asked him if anything was wrong. After standing awkwardly for a while, Harold finally worked up the courage to apologize for what happened last night. Ahti looked surprised, not understanding why Harold was apologizing. He explained that he felt he had taken advantage of her words and pressured her, and just wanted to apologize for that. Harold gently placed the delicate silver ring on her hand as an apology gift. Ahti noticed the craftsmanship and wondered if Harold had bought it especially for her. Harold replied that he had made the ring himself, and that he was quite talented at working with silver. Ahti was surprised to learn that the ring was made just for her. Harold also explains that the silver ring protects against evil spirits and monsters. Ahti was very grateful for this gesture, but she immediately told Harold that he had completely misunderstood the situation. She explained that she was actually happy about what happened last night. She didn't want things to be too rough, which Harold was very gentle and thoughtful. It was a memorable first experience for her to be treated in such a special way. Seeing Harold's face turn red, Ahti guessed he didn't expect her to react like that and probably didn't believe what she said. Right after that, Ahti pushed Harold down on the bed and lay on top of him. Ahti told Harold that if that was the case, she had no choice but to prove it to him. Then she leaned down and gave Harold a passionate kiss. Next, she whispered in his ear, asking if he was ready for a farming evening with her. With an obvious physical reaction that Harold could not hide, he had to agree. As the two became intimate, Ahti, lying on top of Harold, asked if she was too heavy for him, and Harold assured her it was okay. Ahti asked to stay on top of him all night, because she really loves him and wants to express her feelings freely. Even so, she still blamed Harold for making her feel weak and satisfied. As they continued, the bed shook, and in the distance, Echidna stood frozen, horrified by what she was witnessing. Apparently, the snake was shaken by that scene. A few hours later, the crew announced they were approaching an island and would dock for 5 days of supplies. When the ship docked, Harold and Ahti got off, and Harold suggested they go for a walk to explore, hoping to find something interesting. Ahti agreed and said that with so many people around, there must be something interesting to explore. As they stroll through town, Harold comments that the area feels like the port town they stopped at before their journey began. However, Ahti points out that military ports have a completely different atmosphere. Ahti went on to explain that they might have the opportunity to visit several military ports during the trip, and she believed that Harold would be very surprised by the difference between those places and this one. Harold, feeling a bit confused, didn't know what the difference was. Ahti explained that military ports were much stricter, not as noisy as this one, and always crowded with soldiers and sailors walking on the streets. Ahti explained that military ports were much stricter, not as noisy as this one, and always crowded with soldiers and sailors walking on the streets. Noticing the worried look on Harold's face, Ahti realized he was especially interested in those issues. She explained that in military port areas, many people work night shifts, which leads to problems. A large number of soldiers means a large male population, and most of them often go to brothels, causing their families to break up. When strange illnesses or similar problems occur, clinics will be overwhelmed. Atai also shares her worries that those illnesses could cause pain for Harold, so she begs him to take care of himself if they ever visit a military port. As a man, Ati guessed that Harold might be attracted to such places. She admitted that even though she couldn't stop him from going there, she still felt a little jealous at the thought of him being satisfied with another woman. Before she could finish speaking, Harold quickly reassured Adi that she did not need to worry, because he would never need to go to such places, because he was completely satisfied with her. As soon as she heard it, Ati's face turned red, proving that Harold had succeeded in making her heart flutter. About half an hour later, they strolled through a beautiful park and decided to sit down on a bench nearby. The two sat in silence for a minute. Afterwards, Adi took a deep breath and told Harold that she felt relieved and truly appreciated him. She said that she could be physically close to him because she freely chose to. Ati continued to say that if Harold had forced her from the day he bought her, she would definitely have resisted. Harold recalls that the slave trader told him that if a slave disobeyed their master, a sharp needle would be inserted into their neck from the slave collar they wore. Thinking about this, Harold curiously asked Atai when things changed, and when she started to care about him. With a smile, Adi said that from the day Harold suddenly kissed her, her feelings for him began to grow. She also mentioned that in the Northeast continent, where many people looked down on black elves like her, Harold had never treated her like that. It was this that attracted her, for Harold loved her not just as a slave, but as a woman. Hearing this confession, Harold felt a deep trust towards Ati. He decided that there was no need for her to wear the bondage ring anymore, and planned to take it off. But then he realized he didn't know how to remove it. Before Harold could complete that thought, Ati said that the bracelet was proof that she belonged to Harold, and she had no intention of taking it off. Harold was surprised and admitted that he didn't think she would say that, and actually, he found it very cute. As he continued walking, Harold saw a huge ship, clearly a luxury yacht. He remembered seeing a similar ship in a nearby port town. Harold realized that the people on that ship were probably people being transported from the Northeast continent. At that moment, Harold felt something strange and looked behind. Ade, confused, asked him what was wrong, but there was nothing strange behind them. Harold began to wonder if his eyes were playing tricks on him or if he was imagining things that weren't real. The next day, Harold played stick throwing with Echidna around the house, and Adi seemed quite amused, just watching. Harold noticed and asked her if she wanted to try throwing sticks. Adi agreed, and immediately, Echidna caught the stick in her mouth. Just then, a letter was slipped under their door, announcing an upcoming night market event. Harold was surprised because he didn't see any interesting places during the walk. He asked Adi if he wanted to go, and she replied that she didn't mind, seeming to agree. As they walked around the market, they saw that there were many casinos in the area. Because the island was small and a stopping point for many ships, Harold thought that such conditions were ideal for casinos to thrive. Meanwhile, at one of the most popular casinos, Cecil is gambling with two men. She was so talented that her opponents began to suspect she was cheating. With a slightly red face, Cecil replied that she just had wonderful eyes. As Harold and Adi passed by that casino, Harold heard a familiar voice that he was sure belonged to Cecil. Sweat began to form on Harold's forehead. He silently prayed that Varen would not find out about his niece's gambling habits. Although Varen seemed distant and calm, Harold knew he was serious. This makes Harold wonder how Varen would feel if he learned that his precious niece was a gambling addict. Harold realized he owed Varen a lot for the valuable advice he gave him. He begins to wonder if telling Varen about Cecil's gambling habits was the right thing to do. But then Harold quickly realized that might be going too far, so he decided they would pretend not to hear Cecil's voice. Then Harold realized they had been distracted for too long, so he suggested returning to their original purpose and continuing to explore the night market. The next day, Harold and Ate continued to play with Echidna. However, while playing, Harold noticed that Echidna seemed to be getting bigger and bigger as time went on. Although there were no signs of molting, Harold began to wonder when this snake had grown. And he even wondered if Echidna was really a snake. Meanwhile, Harold and Adi heard a noise outside the door. They quickly ran out to see what was going on, and when they got out, they saw Varen angrily entering the building with Cecil in his arms. Apparently, he caught Cecil gambling at the night market and immediately brought her back. Varen scolded Cecil, but she tried to justify her actions, saying that she had lost nothing and had won all her bets. She also boasted that she could clearly see the dice and cards, easily predicting everything, like how each card would be flipped. With those skills, she claims she has no chance of losing. Seeing that Sissel did not regret his actions, Varen decided to turn her around and give her a spanking for using his well-trained eyes. Originally intended for swordsmanship for the wrong purpose, Cecil screamed as he was punished and called Harold for help. At that moment, Adi felt angry when he noticed that Cecil called Harold by his first name without a proper title. Harold sensed a change in Adi's mood and asked her if anything was wrong. Atia replied briefly that it was nothing. Harold teasingly pinched Atia's cheeks, finding her adorable. And as soon as she heard the compliment, her cheeks turned red. It was clear that she had been successfully rizzed up. After a while, they decided to go out for a meal and went to a small restaurant. As he sat down, Harold heard two men talking about a fire that had occurred early in the morning. One house was completely burned down, and the house next door was also half destroyed as the fire spread. This makes Harold feel sad, because he understands all too well the feeling of losing a home. Ati comments that the situation sounds scary, and Harold agrees, wondering if the house was burned on purpose or just careless with the fire. Anyway, they were leaving the island the next day, and Harold didn't expect to be interested in such an unrelated matter. As they walked home, Ati said that after leaving the island, she wanted them to go to the western continent. She thought there might be at least one more stop along the way. After a bit of thought, Harold agreed that it was a good idea. At that time, they met Cecile again, who seemed sad. Cecil calls Harold cold-blooded and complains that he is not the type of person she imagined. She added that she couldn't believe that he just stood by while a girl was punished and did nothing. Adi then asked Harold what he would do about Cecil's annoying complaints. Harold replied that it would be best for them not to interfere in Cecil's affairs this time. However, after thinking of Varen and all he had done for him, Harold decided to tell Cecil that from now on, he would protect her. Hearing that, Cecil admitted that she appreciated Harold's kindness, but Ati started to feel a little jealous. With a pouty expression, she said that Cecil was a cute, petite girl, so it was natural that Harold would want to protect her. Harold, confused by Eddie's sudden attitude, asked why she was acting like that. Adi just replied that it was nothing, but her face looked worried. Harold was sure something was bothering her, so he guessed she was in a bad mood. That evening, when they returned to their room, Harold suggested they go up on deck to look at the night sky. He told Adi that he wanted to do so because he thought it would be great to enjoy this beautiful scene together. Adi agreed, thinking it was a good idea. At that moment, Echidna jumped out of Adi's shirt, signaling that it also wanted to join and enjoy the night scene. When they reached the deck, the night view of the city appeared before their eyes. Although it was a simple scene, Harold realized that it wasn't about what to see, but about appreciating what was right in front of him. Harold turned around and noticed the smile on Ati's face. She was clearly enjoying herself and having fun. After a while of stargazing, Harold suggested they go back to the room. On the way back, they met Varen, and from his dissatisfied expression, Harold could tell that Varen was unhappy. Harold asked Varen why he was out at this hour. Varen replied that he was waiting for his silly niece, Cecil. Looking into Varen's eyes, Harold clearly saw that he was unhappy. Harold guessed that Varen's bad mood was probably related to his disappointment in Cecil. Harold asked Varen what he planned to do when he got home. Varen replied that he would turn Cecil over. He felt there was no other way. It was the only punishment he could think of to teach her a lesson. Varen added that he would tie her up and let her reflect on her mistakes while hanging in the air. Harold thought this punishment seemed a bit excessive and told Varen that he thought it was a bit extreme. With a crazy look in his eyes, Varen asked Harold if he was on Cecil's side. Harold replied that he was only giving his personal opinion and was not taking anyone's side. Varen then tells Harold to be quiet. After that, Harold decided not to argue anymore, not wanting to be scolded anymore. However, he couldn't help but feel that the way Varen treated his niece was a bit too strict. Cecil never listens to Varen, and Harold comments that children often don't realize how their foolish actions can hurt their parents' hearts. Varen agreed, saying that Harold had made a very accurate observation. With a serious expression, Varen explained that he was usually very pleasant with his grandchildren because they were so cute, but this time he couldn't bear it anymore. Cecil actually used his well-trained eyes, originally reserved for swordsmanship, to gamble. Varen could not accept that he had spent precious time training Cecil only for her to use those skills for evil purposes. After listening to Varen, Harold understood that Varen was not angry because of the gambling, but because Cecil used her special ability for unworthy purposes. which reduced her value as a swordsman. Putting that aside, Varen noticed a creature poking its head out from Ati's shirt and asked the two about it. Harold replied that it was their pet, named Echidna. Varen seemed surprised and commented that he was curious as to why they chose a monster as a pet. Harold was surprised to discover that Echidna had been a monster the whole time. Varen was also surprised that Harold and Adi did not realize that they were raising a monster. However, Harold replied that he decided to keep Echidna as a pet because he found it interesting, and now that he thought about it, he didn't care if it was a monster or not. Harold asked Varen how he realized Echidna was a monster. Varen explains that he was once in a maze and saw an identical creature. He also added that Ati knew Echidna was a monster all along. This surprised Harold even more. Ati then explains that she always wondered if Harold knew Echidna was a monster before deciding to raise it. At this moment, Harold felt extremely embarrassed. Varen continues to say that there are people capable of taming monsters, and Ati agrees, but adds that it's something only heard in stories, and it's rare for monsters like Echidna to be friendly to humans. Harold, bored with the subject, suggested moving on to something else. He started by saying that he hoped Cecil would return soon. With a frantic look in his eyes, Varen replied that she had better return, or else she would face unimaginable consequences. Harold laughed and suggested that he and Ati would help Varen search the city for Cecil, as they all agreed that naughty children needed to be punished. He even joked that he would feel better if he could see Cecil hanging in shame. A few minutes later, they prepared and began searching the city for Cecil. When they passed by a casino, Cecil's voice is not heard from inside, where they found her last time, so their new plan is to check other casinos until they find her. While passing a nearby casino, Adi told Harold that she heard Cecil's voice from inside. Harold felt relieved to find Cecil without too much effort. He thanked Adi, commenting that she had saved them a lot of time searching. Harold told Adi that if she needed anything from him in the future, he would do his best to help. Adi replied that if so, she wanted them to have another farm training session. This made Harold blush shyly, but happily agreed, thinking about spending more time with her. As they approached the casino where Cecil was staying, the room suddenly burst into flames. Other gamblers ran out, screaming that a madman had burned down the casino because he lost a bet with a girl. The fire was so intense that Harold couldn't see Cecil immediately. After a few seconds of searching, he saw Cecil in a fighting stance, drawing his sword, screaming at the man who caused the fire just because he lost to her. The man laughed maniacally, saying it was all Cecil's fault for winning game after game. If she had only lost once, this wouldn't have happened. Cecil, furious, called him a bastard and rushed to attack. But before she could make a move, Harold rushed in, grabbed her hand, and told her to stop acting recklessly. Based on the previous conversation, Harold understood what was going on, but if they didn't focus on extinguishing the fire, things would get worse. However, looking at Cecil's expression, it was clear that she wanted to continue facing the man who caused the fire. Harold knew that convincing her to cooperate would be difficult if she didn't calm down. Suddenly, Cecil fainted and fell into Harold's arms.